On a cold morning in 1979, a bulldozer operator working on the expansion of Route 15 north of Frederick, Maryland, stopped his machine mid-motion. He had just clipped the edge of something that was not rock and was not root. It was bone. Within hours, state archaeologists were standing in a shallow trench beside a half-built highway, staring down at what would turn out to be 35 unmarked graves, sealed under 2 centuries of dirt, silence, and denial. Nobody had known they were there. No map showed them. No deed mentioned them. If that machine had rolled 6 feet further before anyone noticed, an entire cemetery of enslaved and free Black Americans might have been paved over and lost forever, their identities erased a second time, this time permanently. That near miss is the reason we are even able to tell this story today, and what came out of that ground over the following 4 decades would eventually do something almost no one expected. It would use the molecules inside human bone to answer questions that written history had refused to answer for 300 years. The site the bulldozer had struck was the cemetery of Catoctin Furnace, an ironworks tucked into the base of the Catoctin Mountains that had been operating since the late 1700s. This was not a minor backwoods operation. Catoctin Furnace employed at least 70 workers at its peak, and it produced munitions used during the Revolutionary War. Cannonballs, tools, cast iron goods, all of it hammered and poured and shaped by hands that were, in large part, enslaved. Sit with that for a second. Weapons that helped a new nation fight for its independence were forged by people who had none of their own. The furnace ran on enslaved and free black labor for roughly 70 years, until the 1840s, when the owners shifted to paid European immigrant workers. Iron kept coming out of that furnace until 1903. And the people who built the operation's early success, who mined the ore, fed the fires, and hauled the raw iron, were buried near the site in a cemetery that had no headstones, no public record, and by the time the highway crews arrived, no living memory attached to it at all. Think about how close that entire discovery came to never happening at all. Highway expansions in the late 1970s moved fast, driven by construction schedules and budgets, not archaeological caution. Unmarked graves with no headstones and no paperwork were, in the eyes of a construction crew, indistinguishable from ordinary dirt. If the machine operator that day had been a few feet to the left, or if the crew had simply kept working through what looked like disturbed soil, an entire community of enslaved ironworkers would have vanished a second time, this time under asphalt, with no chance of ever being studied, named, or connected to a single living descendant. That is the quiet horror sitting underneath this entire story. American history is full of near misses like this one, moments where the difference between remembrance and permanent erasure came down to nothing more than luck and the angle of a bulldozer blade. Once the graves were excavated in 1979 and 1980, the remains were transferred into the custody of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And then something happened that says as much about American priorities as anything in this story. The bones sat in storage for decades, not because scientists lacked curiosity, but because the tools required to actually read the genetic story locked inside 200-year-old skeletal remains simply did not exist yet. And because, frankly, there was no institutional urgency behind digging further into the lives of enslaved iron workers whose names nobody had bothered to record in the first place. It would take until the 2010s for the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society to begin pushing for a serious re-examination, and it would take until 2023 for the full weight of what those bones contained to finally reach the public. When Smithsonian forensic anthropologists Douglas Owsley and Kari Bruelheid went back through the remains in detail, the skeletons themselves started talking before a single strand of DNA had even been extracted. One individual's spine showed clear deformation consistent with a lifetime of carrying extremely heavy loads, the kind of curvature that develops only after years, not months, of relentless physical strain. Another worker's bones carried unusually high levels of zinc, a byproduct released during iron smelting that can build up in the body and cause anemia and other health damage when inhaled repeatedly in an unventilated furnace environment. Researchers also documented craniosynostosis in some remains, a fusing of the skull's growth plates that can be hereditary but may also be linked to prolonged exposure to heavy smoke. None of these people had access to protective equipment. None of them had the right to refuse the work that was slowly breaking their bodies down. Their skeletons became, in effect, medical records nobody ever intended to write, autopsies delivered 2 centuries late. But the skeleton could only tell part of the story. The real breakthrough came when an NIH-funded research team led by geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School, working alongside the Smithsonian and the consumer genetics company 23andMe, decided to attempt something that would have been technically impossible even a decade earlier. They set out to recover and sequence ancient DNA from 27 of the individuals buried at Catoctin Furnace. Extracting usable genetic material from remains that old is brutally difficult. DNA degrades over time, breaking into shorter and shorter fragments as heat, moisture, and bacteria work on it year after year, decade after decade. The technique that made this recovery possible relies heavily on the petrous bone, a small, extremely dense structure at the base of the skull that houses the inner ear. Because of its density, the petrous bone protects genetic material far better than almost any other part of the human skeleton, which is why it has become the single most valuable target for ancient DNA researchers working anywhere in the world. Scientists drill a small sample of bone powder from that structure, dissolve it in specialized chemical buffers, and separate out fragments of ancient DNA that can then be sequenced using the same core technology that powers consumer ancestry kits today. And what they found, published in the journal Science on August 4th, 2023, did not just add a footnote to the history of Catoctin Furnace. It fundamentally changed what could be known about the people who had been forced to build it. The research team compared the genetic profiles of the 27 Catoctin individuals against 23andMe's database of more than 9 million consenting research participants searching for shared segments of DNA known as identical by descent matches, the same technique that powers modern ancestry apps when they tell you that you share DNA with a third cousin you have never met. The results were staggering. Researchers identified 41,799 living genetic relatives connected to the people buried at Catoctin Furnace. Nearly 3,000 of those matches were close enough to suggest a particularly strong biological relationship, the kind that points toward direct descent rather than distant diffuse kinship. 30 of those relatives were found living in Maryland itself, a strong signal that some descendants of the Catoctin workers never left the region their ancestors had been enslaved in, generation after generation choosing, consciously or not, to remain close to home. The genetic data also revealed exactly where in Africa these individuals came from, something that had been considered essentially unrecoverable for the vast majority of enslaved African Americans. The Catoctin individuals showed strong ancestral ties to the Wolof and Mandinka peoples of present-day Senegal and Gambia, and to the Kongo peoples of what is now Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are not vague continent-wide guesses. These are specific ethnic and linguistic communities with their own histories, governance systems, trade networks, and cultural traditions that existed long before any European ship ever anchored off their coastline. For the first time, researchers could look at the remains of a man buried under a Maryland highway and trace his lineage back to a defined region along the Gambia River, or point to a woman's bones and connect her ancestry to Central Africa's Kongo Kingdom. And then the study revealed something else, something the researchers had to state plainly because there was no gentler way to phrase it. Among the men whose remains were analyzed, several carried Y chromosome markers, DNA passed down exclusively from father to son, that traced not to West or Central Africa, but to Great Britain and Ireland. This finding lines up with what historians have documented for years about the origins of European ancestry among African Americans broadly. It overwhelmingly traces back to white men fathering children with enslaved black women, often through coercion and sexual violence, embedded in the power structure of slavery itself. The DNA does not offer euphemisms. It is a molecular record of assault that was never prosecuted, never acknowledged in any court, and in most cases, never even written down, surviving instead in the chromosomes of the children born from it and passed forward for generations. The study also identified 5 distinct genetic family groups among the 27 individuals, made up mostly of mothers, children, and siblings buried near one another. Notably, researchers found no father-child genetic relationships among the remains, a detail that itself speaks to how enslavement fractured family structures, how fathers could be sold away, moved to other plantations, or simply never legally recognized as kin in the first place. Beyond ancestry and family structure, the genetic analysis also traced inherited disease markers forward through time. 3 of the Catoctin individuals carried the gene variant associated with sickle cell disease, and 4 carried a variant linked to G6PD deficiency, a condition affecting red blood cells. Both conditions disproportionately affect people with sub-Saharan African ancestry, and tracing them back to named individuals at Catoctin gives modern descendants a concrete biological thread, connecting present-day health conditions to specific ancestors who lived and died over 200 years ago. As Henry Louis Gates, Jr. of Harvard, one of the historians who contributed to the study, put it, this kind of research represents a tool for empowerment rather than exploitation, a way of using science to answer questions the Black community has been asking for generations, not questions imposed on them from outside. That distinction matters enormously, because the history of American science engaging with Black bodies is not a clean one, and everyone involved in this research understood they were operating inside that shadow. Which is why, even with the study published and the data verified, 23andMe moved cautiously before contacting any of the tens of thousands of genetic matches directly, working instead through the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society and community partners to identify documented descendant families first and prepare them for what the DNA had revealed, rather than dropping a life-altering discovery on someone's phone screen with no context and no support. Researchers involved in the project have spoken openly about being wary of causing harm to people who might receive a connection to enslaved ancestors with no preparation for what that revelation could mean emotionally. Now, here is where the story widens, because Catoctin Furnace is not an isolated case. It is one node in a much larger pattern of erasure and rediscovery that stretches across the entire country, and one of the most staggering examples sits not in the Maryland mountains, but underneath the most valuable real estate on the planet. In the summer of 1991, construction crews preparing the foundation for a new federal office tower in Lower Manhattan hit something that stopped the entire project cold. Digging roughly 30 feet below street level, they uncovered skeletal remains and kept uncovering more. What they had found was a section of what came to be known as the African Burial Ground, a colonial-era cemetery that had been in continuous use from as early as the 1630s until it was officially closed in 1794. Historians now estimate that somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 enslaved and free Africans were buried at this site over more than a century and a half, making it the largest and oldest cemetery of its kind ever discovered in the United States. At the time it was in use, the site sat deliberately outside the boundaries of the settled city, a location chosen specifically because colonial New York did not want its black dead buried among its white citizens, even in death. By the late 1700s, as the city expanded and the nearby Collect Pond became polluted with industrial waste, planners drained the pond and dumped as much as 25 feet of landfill over the entire area, sealing the cemetery under the ground that would eventually become the beating heart of American finance. The African Burial Ground sat forgotten beneath Wall Street for nearly 200 years. When the federal government's General Services Administration first encountered the remains in 1991, their initial plan did not include any serious framework for what to do with the bodies or how to involve the black community in decisions about their own ancestors. That did not sit well with New Yorkers. Activists, scholars, and local residents pushed back hard. And in 1992, the issue escalated all the way to a congressional subcommittee hearing. The pressure worked. Control over the study of the remains was transferred to a team led by biological anthropologist Michael Blakey at Howard University, ensuring that African American scholars and students would be the ones leading the scientific investigation into their own ancestors' remains, rather than having that history interpreted entirely by outside institutions with no direct stake in the community's history. What followed was one of the largest and most detailed skeletal studies ever conducted in American archaeology. Researchers examined 419 individual sets of remains, the largest non-native sample of pre-20th century Americans ever assembled for study, generating a database of more than 200,000 individual observations covering genetics, growth and development, muscle attachment sites, trauma, nutrition, and disease. The project ultimately involved 9 laboratories and universities, roughly 200 students and technicians, and 30 leading doctoral researchers, at a total cost of approximately $6 million, funded to properly document the biological legacy of people that the city itself had spent 2 centuries trying not to see. The findings were devastating and illuminating in equal measure. Nearly half of the remains studied belonged to children under the age of 12, a statistic that on its own tells you almost everything you need to know about the brutality of colonial slavery in the American North, a region often left out of the national conversation about the institution because slavery there is popularly, and wrongly, remembered as smaller and gentler than its southern counterpart. It was not. Researchers documented widespread evidence of malnutrition, infectious disease, lead exposure, and skeletal trauma consistent with punishing physical labor across nearly every individual studied, children included. And yet, within all of that suffering, the bones also carried unmistakable evidence of cultural survival. 27 individuals were found with filed teeth, a deliberate cosmetic and cultural practice specific to parts of West Africa, proof that these particular people had been born and raised in Africa before being forced across the Atlantic, arriving already carrying the marks of communities and traditions the slave trade tried to strip away from them. Several female burials showed distinct bone ridges at the base of the skull, a physical marker caused by years of carrying heavy loads balanced on the head, a traditional West African practice that these women continued to carry out, even after being forced into bondage in a foreign land, their bodies preserving a cultural inheritance that no law and no chain could erase. Genetic and isotopic testing at the site also drew a detailed map of exactly where in Africa these individuals had come from, connecting maternal lineages to communities across present-day Ghana, Nigeria, Niger, Senegal, and Benin. Put together with the Catoctin findings, a picture starts to emerge that written colonial records never came close to capturing. Enslaved people in America were not an undifferentiated mass with no history before their arrival. They were Wolof traders, Mandinka communities, Kongo craftspeople, Akan, Igbo, and Fon peoples, each carrying distinct languages, belief systems, and social structures, that colonial law tried to flatten into a single legal category, and that their bones, centuries later, refused to let disappear. After nearly a decade of study, the remains from the African burial ground were placed into hand-carved mahogany coffins crafted in Ghana and ceremonially reinterred at the original site in October 2003 in an event known as the Rites of Ancestral Return, drawing participants from across the African diaspora. In October 2007, the site was formally dedicated as the African Burial Ground National Monument, becoming the first federally recognized monument in the United States built specifically to honor enslaved Africans, a designation that took a bulldozer accident, a community fight, and a congressional hearing to finally secure. What both of these sites prove together is something that should unsettle anyone who has ever accepted the excuse that enslaved people's individual histories simply cannot be recovered because the written record does not exist. For generations, that argument was treated as an insurmountable wall. There are no names in the ledgers, historians would say, no birth certificates, no family trees, so the personal history of the enslaved is permanently, tragically lost to time. The 1870 census, the first U.S. census to list all Black Americans by name, rather than as anonymous property entries, effectively became a hard wall behind which most African American genealogical research simply stopped, as if millions of people's ancestors had appeared out of nothing. What Catoctin Furnace and the African burial ground demonstrate is that this wall was never really about what could be known. It was about what institutions were willing to invest resources into finding out. The DNA was always there, sealed inside bone, waiting for a drill, a database, and a research team willing to ask the question. And the pace of this kind of discovery is only accelerating. The cost of sequencing ancient DNA has fallen dramatically over the past decade, tracking the same technological curve that made consumer ancestry testing a mainstream product in the first place. Direct-to-consumer genetic databases now hold the profiles of tens of millions of people, giving researchers an enormous pool of living relatives to cross-reference against historical remains. Experts in the field of archaeogenomics increasingly describe this moment as a genuine inflection point. Within the coming years, it will likely become both technically and financially realistic to sequence a far larger share of the unidentified remains held in American museum collections, and to compare that data against ever-expanding living genetic databases. Only 27 of the more than 100 individuals buried at Catoctin have been genetically analyzed so far. Only 419 of an estimated 15 to 20,000 burials at the African Burial Ground site were studied in detail before the remains were reinterred. Across the country, hundreds of other colonial and antebellum-era Black cemeteries exist in varying states of documentation, some carefully maintained, some quietly forgotten, some still sitting undisturbed beneath farmland, parking lots, and highways, exactly like the one a bulldozer nearly destroyed outside Frederick, Maryland in 1979. There's also a harder conversation embedded in all of this, one that researchers themselves have been careful and public about. The scientific community's history with Black communities in America is not one that automatically earns trust, and the people leading these studies know it. That history includes the Tuskegee syphilis study, the non-consensual use of Henrietta Lacks's cells, and generations of extractive research that treated Black bodies as data sources, rather than as people connected to living families with a right to be consulted. Which is why the researchers behind the Catoctin study have emphasized community consultation at every stage, working directly with the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society and the African American Resources Cultural and Heritage Society of Frederick, Maryland, rather than simply publishing results and moving on. It is why 23andMe has proceeded carefully in deciding how, when, and whether to notify the tens of thousands of people whose DNA connects them to the Catoctin Cemetery, weighing the very real value of that knowledge against the risk of delivering it without support or context. And it is a large part of why control over the African burial ground research shifted to Howard University in the first place, ensuring that the people interpreting this history had a direct personal and professional stake in doing it responsibly. That caution extends beyond who gets contacted and when. Researchers involved in both projects have had to wrestle with harder questions, too, questions that do not have clean answers. What happens when a genetic match reveals a family secret nobody was prepared to confront? An unexpected line of European ancestry traced directly to sexual violence committed generations ago, or a family structure that contradicts the story a family has told itself for years. What obligation, if any, does a research institution have to a person who never signed up to learn something this heavy about their own bloodline, but who consented years earlier to a much more casual ancestry test, never imagining it would connect them to a colonial-era ironwork cemetery? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the exact kind of questions the Catoctin research team addressed directly in a companion ethics paper published alongside the main study, because the scientists involved understood that producing accurate data was only half the job. Delivering that data responsibly, to real people with real emotional stakes, was the other half, and arguably the harder one. There is an economic dimension here too, one that rarely gets discussed alongside the genetics. The iron produced at Catoctin Furnace helped supply a revolution that created an independent nation. The land cleared, the buildings raised, and the infrastructure built by enslaved labor in colonial New York became the literal foundation beneath what is now one of the most valuable financial districts on earth. None of the wealth generated by that labor was ever paid to the people who produced it, and none of it was inherited by their descendants, even as it compounded for others across 2.5 centuries. The DNA does not settle that account. It cannot. What it does is make the people behind that labor undeniably, individually visible again, with names still largely unknown, but with lineages, family groups, and living relatives that can now be documented with the same scientific confidence as a modern paternity test. Which brings this back to the tens of thousands of people walking around right now with a direct, provable genetic connection to the enslaved men and women of Catoctin Furnace, most of whom have absolutely no idea. Somewhere in Maryland, in the wider southeast, and scattered across the rest of the country, there are people whose family history was assumed to be permanently cut off at 1870, who now have a documented, scientifically verified thread reaching back into the 1700s, connecting them to a specific cemetery, a specific ironworks, and specific ancestors who mined ore, fed furnace fires, and were buried without headstones near the Catoctin Mountains. The bones did not choose to stay silent for 200 years. They stayed silent because nobody had the tools, and for a long stretch of that time, because nobody with institutional power thought the silence was worth breaking. Now the tools exist, the databases exist, the willingness, however cautious and however overdue, finally exists too. The question left standing at the end of both of these stories is not whether this history can be recovered, because that question has already been answered twice over, once beneath a Maryland highway and once beneath the streets of lower Manhattan. The real question is how many more sites like these are still out there, still unmarked, still sitting under farmland or parking lots or another stretch of highway waiting to be expanded, and whether the country is willing to go looking for them before the next bulldozer gets there first. Every year without that search is another year unmarked cemeteries sit exposed to development, erosion, and bad luck. Catoctin Furnace survived because a highway crew noticed bone instead of driving straight through it. The African burial ground survived because a community refused to let a federal agency quietly finish the job. Neither outcome was guaranteed. The science now exists to read the story hidden in American soil. What happens next depends on whether anyone with the resources to act is willing to go looking before the ground is paved over for good.